Good morning, Cornerstone. How's everybody doing this morning? Let's stand, and we'll start our worship together. It's a good day to praise the Lord. Let's have joy and worship Him this morning. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. One more time. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. To see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. See you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy. High and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. I want to see you. Amen. Let's turn and share the love of the Lord to each other this morning. stand, church, so we continue our worship together. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. He's been my fourth man in the fire, time after time. Born of His Spirit, washed in His blood, and what He did for me on Calvary is more than enough. I trust in God, my Savior, the one who will never fail. He will never fail. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I know the author of tomorrow ordered my steps. So this is my story, this is my song, praising my risen King and Savior all the day long. I trust in God, my Savior, the one who will never fail. He will never fail. I trust in God, my Savior, the one who will never fail. He will never fail. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. That's why I trust Him. That's why I trust Him. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. That's why I trust Him. That's why I trust in God, my Savior, the one who will never fail. He will never fail. My Savior, the one who will never fail. He will never fail. I trust in God. Finding myself at a loss for words, and the funny thing is, it's okay. last thing I need is to be heard, but to hear what you would say. Word of God, speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God, speak. Finding myself in the midst of you, beyond the music, beyond the noise. All that I need is to be with you, and in the quiet, hear your voice. Word of God, speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God, speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God, speak. Finding myself at a loss for words, and the funny thing is, it's okay.
you to take a breath so that they can say what they want to say. It was not an uncommon thing for rabbis to be asked to settle disputes among people. So in and of itself, the question is not necessarily bad. But, evidently these two brothers, they had a father who had died. It was the two brothers, and it was time to divide up the inheritance. And for whatever reason, the older brother had not given the younger brother his portion of the inheritance. Generally speaking, the older brother was always given 2/3 of the inheritance, the younger brother 1/3. And the reason for that was because the older brother had the responsibility for caring for the rest of the family. So he was given a larger portion so that he had the finances to care for the family. So this younger brother here is saying, well, wait a minute, my brother, the executor of the state, he hadn't shared this with me. And he tells the Lord to tell him that. As a pastor, let me say this. I've done many, many funerals in the years that I've been pastoring. And one thing I have seen more than once, which is very unsettling to me, I've seen families that got along perfectly well until somebody died. And then when somebody died, and there was an inheritance to be had, the most ungodly attitudes came out of those people. Because they were fighting over money and possessions and stupid things. You've heard an old saying, where there's a will, there's a... there's a bunch of relatives who have never met and they want part of the inheritance. That's what it is. That's what happens when there's a will. No, I'm sort of joking here. But, when you notice how this whole situation unfolds between these two brothers, Jesus is teaching a crowd. He's teaching about hypocrisy. He's teaching about spiritual matters. He's teaching about things that are eternally significant. And in the middle of his teaching, this man interrupts Jesus and demands that he tell his brother to divide up the family inheritance with him. This tells me one thing about this man. He is not hearing a single thing that Jesus is saying. He is so concerned with this situation that he isn't even concerned about interrupting Jesus. There's no situational awareness, if you will, of the fact that Jesus is teaching a multitude. This is not a right time to bring this up. And let's be honest, how many times have you come into church with something heavy on your mind, and it was really difficult to concentrate on the message because your mind keeps drifting back to that issue that's concerning you? Some of you are doing that right now. And you start to think about those things because it's just looming heavy in your mind. And that's what's going on in this man. Jesus is talking and the words are coming out, but he's really not hearing a single thing Jesus is saying because he's thinking, oh, that brother of mine, I tell you what, Dad's been dead for 4 months now and he's still just living the high life on that farm and all, and I bet you he's burning up part of my inheritance and he's probably not going to give me that, and he's probably got the cuckoo clock that I always wanted. And, it's just going, he's just consumed with all these thoughts, and finally he just jumps up and blurts this out. He's so preoccupied with this. Now, the response of Jesus is very interesting. He says, man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you? Now, notice what Jesus says. He says, man. The Greek word is anthropos there. And so he doesn't say friend. He doesn't say brother or hey, dude, or whatever. He says, man. When God starts out and addresses you as, hey, man, that's not going to end well. That is not going to be a good ending right there. I can just tell you that. Jesus refuses to get involved with this argument, and for several good reasons. First of all, if Jesus began settling every single argument between people, you know what? That's all he would be doing. He would never be sharing the gospel with anyone. He would be settling arguments all day long. Why do I say that? Because when Moses brought the people out of Egypt, and they were in the wilderness, remember his father-in-law, Jethro, not from the hillbillies, his father-in-law, Jethro, comes and he sees him and he says, what are you doing? Well, the people bring the disputes to me and I settle them all. And it says he was doing this from morning until evening. And Jethro says, the thing that you're doing is not good. You're going to wear yourself out and the people. So it wasn't just going to wear him out, it was going to wear the people out as well. And he said, you need to appoint other people to take care of these issues. And then if there's an issue they can't resolve, then they can bring it to you. But you see, Moses had basically 2.5, 3 million people. Can you imagine having to settle the disputes of that many people? I mean, you look at our court systems today, and it's crazy. I mean, the court systems are so backed up. I've been called to testify in a case against a drug dealer. I ran a call as an EMT, and I've been on that case for 2.5 years. They've been working that case for 2.5 years. I've been called to court 5 times for this. And so when you look at it, you see these things, and Jesus realizes, no, I'm not going to get involved in this matter. Now, the second reason that Jesus knew there was no answer he could give that would actually solve the real problem that's here. The real problem was an issue of greed within the hearts of both brothers. And understand it's both brothers, because we know this because when Jesus uses the word you in the original language, it's the plural. So he's not just talking about the brother who addressed him, he's talking about both of them. He sees there's greed within both of these men. And so he's speaking to both of them. As long as both of these brothers had greed in their hearts, neither of them were going to be satisfied with any settlement that Jesus would suggest. And so Jesus admonishes them about this covetousness, this greed, and now he's going to illustrate it with a parable. But he says to them at first, and he sets out a principle, and he says, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. Now, I want you to stop there, and I want you to look at something I had never noticed here before. He says, beware and be on your guard against what? Every form of greed. Have you ever thought about the fact that there are different forms of greed? I mean, generally speaking, we think of greed in terms of money or material possessions. But there's other types of greed. Because greed is simply a lust for more of something. And it can manifest itself in a variety of ways. It can be a desire for a higher position. And we can get angry because, I deserve that promotion, not that guy over there. He's a slacker. He comes in late. He leaves early. I work hard. I work my fingers to the bone. I should have had that promotion. And you coveted that. It can be an ungodly desire for more power. We see that so often in the politics. It could be that desire for prestige or respect from others. It can actually even be a desire for affirmation from others. As a counselor, I've had the unfortunate necessity to deal with couples where there's been adultery involved. And many times, it's because that one spouse wanted affirmation that they weren't getting from their husband or wife, and so they go out looking for it somewhere else. So there's a lot of types of greed. The funny thing is that in the spiritual realm, even spiritual people know how to play this, because televangelists, television preachers, they often play on people's greed to coerce them to give money to their ministries. And they promise their listeners that if they will just plant a seed of faith by giving money to that ministry, then God is obligated to pay them back tenfold. Scriptures out of context and all. And what are they doing? They know the human heart, and so they're playing against the greed of that person, saying, well, if you just give this to me, then God's got to give this to you. He's obligated. And that's really not giving to God. That is basically treating God like an investment broker. And televangelists are appealing to the greed within people to enrich themselves, which they're also greedy. So even when you look at it, greed can even be cloaked in that spirituality, if you will. Now, Jesus goes on to explain why we need to beware of greed, and he says, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of possessions. That's probably one of the most important verses in this passage. Please allow that to sink into your heart. That even if you have an abundance in life, that's not life. Your life doesn't consist of your possessions. And in saying this, Jesus has just defined the economy in which we live in this world, when you think about it. People in this world find their value, they find their self-worth in the abundance of their possessions. I've got the bigger house, I've got the newer car, I've got the fancier car, I've got the vacation home, I've got this, I've got that. And many people define their lives by their possessions. Thank you. There was a little amen, I think, back there, by the kids. But, You know, you've seen that bumper sticker, haven't you? He who dies with the most toys wins. You know, there's actually a scriptural response to that one, because I saw another sticker one day when I was going down the road that says, he who dies with the most toys still dies. Yes. So, you know, there is sort of an answer to that statement there. But in his first letter to Timothy, the Apostle Paul said this. He said, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. And I love that verse because, you know, possessing wealth is not wrong. There is no prohibition in Scripture from possessing wealth. Please understand that. The Bible does not condemn wealth. Many people in the Bible were godly people who were wealthy. You see Abraham, you see David, you see Solomon, you see Lydia, you see Joseph of Arimathea. These were people who, by those standards of that day, were very wealthy people, but they used it in a proper way. God doesn't want us to fix our hope on our earthly wealth, but to have a grateful heart for what He's given us. And I'll be honest with you, I believe that the people who can enjoy the wealth most are believers. When we have a right attitude of the things that God has given us, we can be those who truly do enjoy the things God has given us because we know the source of them. And if something happens and they're taken away, our source of joy is not in those things, it's in God. And therefore, if something happens and they go away, it doesn't change how we feel. It doesn't ruin our lives. But life is not about our possessions. And Jesus illustrates this with this parable. And once again, when you start to take this parable apart, it's very interesting. The land of this rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning within himself, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? And he says, well, here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns. I'll build bigger ones. I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, you know, you've got all these goods laid up for the rest of your life. Now it's time to take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But then God says to him, you fool, this very night your soul was required of you. And now who will have what you've prepared? Notice that this man was already very rich. He didn't lack anything before he had this bumper crop. He was already abundantly supplied for. He's already wealthy by worldly standards. Now remember, in the ancient world, to have an abundance of food was an indication of wealth. Most people lived sort of a hand-to-mouth existence. They would go out as a day laborer, they would work. The Scripture always commanded the master to pay their laborers at the end of the day. The reason being is because normally they would leave their workplace, they would go to the market, they would buy food for that night. And so every day, it was that type of existence. We cannot relate to that. Because every single one of us can leave here today, get into a very comfortable car, drive home, park our car, walk into our kitchen, and we got stuff on the shelves, we got stuff in the refrigerator, we got stuff in the freezer, we've got an abundance. We could probably not shop for a month and still have enough food to eat. And so trying to think of it as a day-to-day existence is a little difficult for us. But here's a man who was extremely wealthy because he had enough not just for the next day or week or month, but for basically the rest of his life. And this man asks a question. He says, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? In answering this question, the will of God and the needs of others never cross his mind. He never thinks about. His question is not like, well, what would God want me to do with all this stuff? His question isn't, well, what's going on with my neighbors? Who could I help? Who could I bless with these things? He never thinks about that. And I want to challenge you with a question today. This probably won't be a very popular sermon. It might not get a lot of views. Do we ever ask God that question when we have an abundance? And I would say to you, in the country we live in right now, every single one of us has an abundance. Or do we just assume that when we have an abundance, it's time we're going to redecorate the kitchen, remodel the kitchen. We're going to fix the bathroom. We're going to put in a new, bigger screen. We're going to add more channels to our cable TV. Do we think that it's just something to spend on ourselves? Or do we look at it and go, you know, I really have enough in life. I really have all my needs taken care of. God must have given me this abundance because He wants me to use it somewhere else. And that's scriptural. If you look in 1 Corinthians, read through it. Because Paul talks about our abundance being to meet a need for others. Do we ever think about that? Because, sometimes we look at these parables and we want to hold them at arm's length. And I looked at that this week, and it's convicting to me. Because I don't know that I can honestly say that I always look at an abundance that I have and go, God, you know what? I really don't need this. Who else needs this? This man concludes that he must tear down his barns and build bigger ones to store the abundance of his harvest. The irony of this is once this project is done, once he's built these bigger barns, and once all these crops have been safely stored away, he thinks he's set for life and he can just now take it easy. I'm going to take my ease. You know what that tells me is when he says, well, I'm going to take my ease, that means that up to this point, he hasn't taken any ease. He's been working the long hours. He's been getting up early and staying up late and managing all these accounts and doing all these things to try to make this money in life. And now he's ready to take this ease. But there are two mistakes in his reasoning. First, he assumes his crops will be secure. He thinks that if he builds a bigger barn and sticks them in that barn, hey, I'm set for life. What happens when a tornado or a hurricane or a wind or something else comes along and tears down those barns and destroys his crops? Happened in the book of Job. Job was a very wealthy man, and one day he was reduced to a pauper. He never took that into account. You know what? The worldly things that we possess, I don't care how you set them up, they are not secure in this world. We could have a market crash at any time. And so if we put our hope in those things, and I'm not saying you don't invest, don't get me wrong, that's not my point here. But if we put our hope in those things, our hope is misplaced. The second mistake he makes is he assumed that he had, and I quote here, many years to come. Not one of us here thinks that we don't have more time. We all do. That's our natural assumption. I got today, I got tomorrow, next week. And we set up our calendars. I can take you out and I can look and show you my calendar for the rest of this year. And there's that assumption that I'm going to be around for the rest of this year. Provided I don't tell a really bad joke and get stoned to death. No, but I mean, but we have that assumption that we're going to live, longer and longer and longer. And he assumed that he was going to live a long life, but in reality, his soul was required of him that very night. The Bible warns us about falsely presuming upon the future. And in the book of James, he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and such boasting is evil." You see, the rich man was a fool in God's eyes because he was boasting about the future. Hey, I've got all this stuff stored up. I'm good to go. And he felt financially secure. And here's the problem with his feelings of financial security. His financial security left him with that attitude, hey, I don't need God. I don't need to worry about God. I don't need to worry about spiritual things. I'm set. I'm good to go. When I get older, well, then I'll worry about spiritual things. Then I'll start thinking about spiritual things. But right now, I don't need to worry about that. And he had no concern for others. He didn't think about those around him who might have a need. And what I say about this guy is he was suffering from an eye problem. And I don't mean an EYE problem. I mean an eye problem. Because look at what this man says. Look at how many times he says, I will. He says, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns. I will store my grain. I will say to my soul. If you go back and you look at this, if you look at it in the English translation, he uses 11 personal pronouns of I and my. If you go into the original Greek, there's actually 12 of them. 12 times he's talking about himself. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what's going to happen with me. Here's what I think. Here's what and that's all it is. It's I. He's made all kinds of plans for the future based solely on his own personal desires, not realizing that he would step into eternity that very night. And so Jesus concludes this parable and he says, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Again, God doesn't say we shouldn't prepare for the future. In fact, the Bible teaches just the opposite, that we are to prepare for the future. Because when you go into the book of Proverbs, it says, consider the ant, O sluggard, that how he prepares in the summer for the winter. So, there is a logic to, and there is a reasonableness to preparing, to having a retirement account or to having a savings account or to paying off your credit cards and your bills and things like that. That's not what this is talking about. This is not saying you shouldn't do that and that you should just never plan and just throw caution to the wind. It's not saying that, and it doesn't teach that. We're not forbidden to save money or to have retirement accounts. We are not, though, to hoard our possessions when we have an abundance and we see others who are in need. And I would suggest to you that we will always see others that are in need. Why do I say that? Because the Scripture says that. Jesus said when he was sitting at the table, and remember the woman came in and she anointed Jesus with a very costly perfume, and they're like, oh, why was this wasted and all that? And he starts talking, he says, the poor you will have with you always. There will always be impoverished people in this world because we live in a fallen world. And so that gives us that opportunity to minister to the needs of those who are impoverished, who need help from us. And so there's always that opportunity to do good to the poor. But we're to prayerfully consider how to use the resources that God has entrusted to us. You know, it's been said that you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. And we came into this world with nothing. Not a single person came into this world. You didn't have clothes on your back or anything. You came in kicking and screaming and all messy, you know. And, you know, we're going to leave this world with nothing. We're not taking anything with us. You know, there are no U-Hauls behind a hearse. Actually, I did see a U-Haul behind a hearse one time. It was really weird. I did see that, and I wanted to take a picture of it because I thought that'd be the coolest thing to use in one of these sermons and everything. But, you know, obviously it wasn't for that guy. But, you know, one thing we can do, we can invest in the kingdom of God. And I want to wrap up here. We're going to be a little bit short today, so you can thank me later. But there's two things that stand out about this rich man in this parable. The first is he never looked beyond himself. When you look at his thought process in this parable, it's only filled with thoughts about himself and what he's going to do for himself. He was only worried about his welfare. He was only worried about his own pleasure. He was only worried about his own security. He never looked beyond himself to see the needs of those around him. And I want to challenge you today. Do we do that? Do we look around at our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, someone on the street, whatever it may be? Do we look around and do we see the needs around us? There will always be people who have needs around us, as I mentioned. You know, Jesus said, the poor you'll have with you always. There will always be those needs. The question is, will we take the time to see them? It's interesting. I teach a course, a critical incident course, and in it I have a video that is a very fascinating video by a research group. And they did something really interesting. They took people that were traveling this one street. I think it was in New York City at the time. I'm not sure. It was in some major city. And they took one of their relatives and they dressed him up as a homeless person. And they put him right in the path of their relative to see, would they even recognize them? Would they even look down and see that it was their relative? And they had like 4 or 5 different people they did this with. And do you realize not one of them recognized them? Not one of them. They were just dressed in raggedy clothes. They wasn't makeup to make them look like a different person. They were just dressed up in raggedy clothes, sitting there like with a cardboard box and some other things, you know, a grocery cart or something like that. And every single one of them passed by and never noticed them. Interesting, because in the video, they bring the person back in and then they show them the video. At the end of the video, it says, are you really looking? And you know, this sermon convicts me. Because it's so easy in the culture in which we live and the technology we have to be so busy that we forget about those around us. So busy, and we can have the perfect excuse, hey, I'm late for this, or I got to get to this, or I got to do that. And you know, we don't look around at the needs around us. We don't have that awareness. This man never looked beyond himself. You know, it's easy for me to point to this rich guy in this parable and go, well, that's not me. But, you know, sometimes I look at that and I look at the mirror of the Word and go, well, you know, is that me? Maybe it is. But secondly, he never looked beyond his life. All this rich man's plans were made for the present life with no consideration for the next. He was going to build bigger storehouses in which to store his harvest. He was going to live the rest of his life in careless ease, but he never prepared for eternity. And the tragedy of this man's life is not what he left behind, but what he faced ahead. You know, there's a story I want to pretty much wrap up with here. Never believe me when I say I'm going to wrap up, but they'll take 2 or 3 wrap-ups here. But it's an interesting story of a king who he delighted in the people of his kingdom. And his greatest delight, though, was in his court jester. And when the king had problems or when he was sad or feeling depressed, he would call in the court jester, and the court jester would talk to him and entertain him and make him laugh. And one day the king had an idea. And so he called his court jester in, and he presented the court jester with a golden wand. And he told the court jester, he says, you know, little buddy, you've always made me happy. I've always laughed at everything you've done, and you've always brought cheer to my life. He says, I want you to take this golden wand, and I want you to go out throughout my entire kingdom, and I want you to search and see if there's a greater fool than you in the kingdom. So find another court fool in the kingdom. And so he hands him the wand, and the jester goes out, and the jester begins going from village to village and questioning people and talking to people. And during that time, while the jester is out on this search for a greater fool, he gets word from the palace that the king has become deathly sick. And so the court jester is called back to the palace to come and to see the king. And so he comes into the chambers, and the king is lying in bed, and the king tells the jester that he's going on this long, long journey from which he would never return, as he's speaking to the jester about his death. And so the jester says, well, have you prepared for this journey, O king? And the king says, well, no, I haven't. And the jester sets the golden wand on his chest and says, then you are a greater fool than I am. We don't want to be fools. So I want to leave you a challenge today to consider what God desires of you. I cannot tell you what your needs are in life. Only you, but that's between you and God. But how has God blessed you? And how does he want you to use those blessings? You know, I heard a Christian financial counselor say one time that we need to determine in our lives how much is enough. And once we determine how much is enough to live on, then we have to assume that God wants us to use the rest of it for his kingdom. And that's interesting. And that is something that I have learned, that as God has multiplied the finances in my wife and my life, that, you know, if we can maintain just the same level that we're living and not say, oh, well, more money means more things, because our life doesn't consist of possessions. It's opened up the door not just to give, you know, to tithe to this church and to give to other ministries around the community, but around the world. And, you know, it's given us that opportunity to invest in the kingdom to come. And so we ask, how much is enough for us? You know, if God required your soul tonight, would you have invested wisely from a spiritual perspective? Or would God say to you, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you've prepared? Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for your word. And Lord, I know that this message is very challenging to me. It makes me rethink my finances. It makes me rethink what I give and what I keep. It makes me rethink how I use what you've entrusted to me. Because, Father, technically we don't own anything. We are stewards, because this all goes back to you when we step into eternity anyway. And so, Father, I pray that today you would speak to our hearts. How do you want us to use those things that you've entrusted to us? Give us a heart to hear you speak to us. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you all.
Let's stand as we close in song.
Great is your faithfulness, oh God. You wrestle with the sin and restless heart. You lead us by still waters into mercy, and nothing can keep us apart. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. God of Jacob, you use that we